In the small town of Greenfield, nestled between the hills and the quiet woods, life seemed to move at a predictable pace. The kind of town where neighbors knew each other's names and secrets were rarely kept for long. But like most small towns, Greenfield had its own hidden stories, buried deep beneath the surface. On the outside, the McAllister family was the epitome of normalcy. James McAllister, a successful lawyer, was well respected in the community, and his wife, Claire, was an active member of the church. Their daughter, Emily, had just graduated from high school. She was a bright, beautiful young woman with big dreams of leaving Greenfield to explore the world. Emily's life, however, was far from the picture-perfect image it appeared to be. Beneath her charming smile and innocent demeanor, there was a secret she kept hidden from everyone, even her parents. She had become involved in a dangerous and forbidden relationship with someone who should have been untouchable, a man of the cloth. Father Daniel Harris, the parish priest at St. Mary's Church, had been a part of the community for over a decade. He was respected and admired by the townspeople for his unwavering faith and charitable works. His sermons were heartfelt, and he had a way of making everyone feel connected to something greater than themselves. But beneath the holy exterior, Father Daniel harbored dark desires, desires that had drawn him into a scandalous affair with Emily. It began innocently enough. Emily, seeking solace after a difficult year at school, began spending more time at the church, helping with various activities and community events. Father Daniel was kind and attentive, offering guidance and comfort. But what started as an innocent friendship soon escalated into something much more dangerous. In the quiet corners of the church, away from the prying eyes of the community, Emily and Father Daniel began an affair that would tear apart their lives and ultimately lead to an unthinkable tragedy. It was a Saturday morning when the first signs of something had gone terribly wrong. A passerby, a jogger out for her usual early run, noticed something odd near the church. The church grounds, usually so well maintained, seemed oddly deserted, with no sign of Father Daniel's car parked outside. As she approached the back of the church, something caught her eye. Blood, dark and fresh, splattered across the stone walkway. Her heart raced as she approached cautiously, her breath catching in her throat when she saw the body. The lifeless form of Father Daniel lay sprawled on the ground, a pool of blood forming around his head. His face was pale, his eyes staring blankly at the sky. The jogger quickly pulled out her phone and dialed 911. Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance, signaling the arrival of the police. Detective Lisa Matthews was called to the scene just after the coroner had confirmed Father Daniel's death. Lisa was a seasoned investigator, known for her sharp instincts and unwavering determination to uncover the truth. She had seen her fair share of grisly murders, but something about this case felt different. Father Daniel's death appeared to be a brutal attack, but there were no obvious signs of struggle. His clothes were neat, and his body was positioned in a way that seemed too deliberate to be a random act of violence. The detective's first task was to interview those closest to the priest. His death had sent shockwaves through the community, and everyone was eager to know who could have possibly harmed such a beloved figure. As Lisa questioned the parishioners, she learned that Father Daniel had been well liked, but there were whispers of tension beneath the surface. Some mentioned that he had been spending an unusual amount of time with Emily McAllister in recent months. At first, the connection seemed harmless, just a young girl seeking guidance from the local priest. But as Lisa dug deeper, she uncovered more troubling details. Emily McAllister had been in and out of the church more frequently than usual. Lisa decided to visit the McAllister household to speak with Emily. When she arrived, Emily greeted her with a forced smile, her nervous energy palpable. "Detective Matthews, how can I help you?" Emily asked, trying to mask her anxiety. "I'm investigating the death of Father Daniel Harris," Lisa explained, watching Emily closely for any signs of distress. "I understand you spent a lot of time with him in recent months." Emily's eyes widened for a split second, and then she quickly composed herself. "Yes, I did. I volunteered at the church. He helped me with some personal matters." Lisa noted the hesitation in her voice, but didn't push further just yet. She asked Emily about her whereabouts the night before the murder. "I was at home with my parents," Emily said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying her unease. I didn't know anything about it until the police called this morning. The courtroom was packed. The small town of Greenfield, once known for its quiet charm and tight-knit community, now found itself at the center of a media frenzy. Emily McAllister, the 18-year-old girl who had once been the picture of innocence, now sat at the defendant's table, facing charges of first-degree murder. The courtroom was filled with tension as townspeople, reporters, and members of the press filled every available seat. The air was thick with whispers, and the eyes of the community were on Emily. How could a young girl so seemingly pure be capable of such a horrifying act? The questions flooded the room, but no one could yet understand the depth of what had truly transpired. Emily's defense attorney, a seasoned lawyer named Richard Jacobs, rose to speak first. He was a man with a reputation for getting his clients acquitted, no matter the odds. With his sharp suit and calm demeanor, he seemed unshaken by the gravity of the case. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Richard began, his voice smooth and composed, "we are here today because of a tragedy, an unfortunate series of events that led to the loss of a beloved figure in this town. Father Daniel Harris was a man of God, and his death is a tragedy. But let us not be blinded by the overwhelming emotions surrounding this case. Let us focus on the facts." He paused, scanning the room before continuing. "Emily McAllister is not a cold-blooded killer. She is a young woman who was manipulated and coerced by a man who should have known better, a man who abused his position of power. Father Daniel preyed on her, and when she realized the full scope of his deceit, she acted in self-defense." Richard's argument was clear. Emily had been seduced and manipulated by Father Daniel, a man she had trusted implicitly. He painted a picture of a vulnerable teenager who had been led into a dangerous affair by someone who should have been a moral guide, not a predator. Across the room, the prosecutor, Claire Dawson, rose to counter the defense's argument. Claire was a seasoned lawyer herself, known for her fierce determination and sharp focus. She wasted no time in addressing the issue at hand. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, there is no question that Father Daniel Harris was a respected man in this town," Claire began, her voice firm. "He was a man who devoted his life to his parish, to his faith, and to the people of Greenfield. But that does not mean he was beyond reproach." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. "The evidence we present will show that Emily McAllister was not the innocent victim she portrays herself to be. Yes, Father Daniel manipulated her. Yes, he took advantage of his position of power. But that does not excuse the violence that Emily inflicted upon him. This was not an act of self-defense. This was murder, cold, calculated, and brutal." Claire's gaze never left Emily as she continued. "Emily McAllister took the life of a man who trusted her, a man who gave her guidance and support. There is no justification for what she did. The evidence will show that Emily planned the murder, that she had ample opportunity to leave the church, but instead she chose to end Father Daniel's life in a fit of rage." The trial began with the testimony of Emily's mother, Claire McAllister. Claire, a woman of poise and grace, walked to the witness stand with a mixture of grief and confusion on her face. She had spent the last few months in a haze trying to come to terms with the horrific reality of her daughter's involvement in the murder. Claire was sworn in and took her seat on the stand. She looked at her daughter briefly before turning her attention to the prosecutor. "Mrs. McAllister," Claire Dawson began, her tone respectful, "can you tell us about the relationship between your daughter and Father Daniel?" Claire hesitated before answering, clearly torn. "At first I thought it was just a simple friendship. Emily was always very active in church activities, and Father Daniel was a kind man who supported her. I never suspected anything inappropriate." She paused again, her voice breaking as she continued. "But in the weeks leading up to his death, I began to notice changes in Emily. She was more withdrawn, more distant. She wasn't herself. When I asked her about it, she would brush me off. I never knew what was really going on. I never knew the full extent of their relationship." Claire's testimony painted a picture of a mother in denial, unable to see the warning signs until it was too late. She had trusted Father Daniel, never suspecting that the priest she held in such high regard had been the one to corrupt her daughter. Next, it was Emily's turn to take the stand. Her hands trembled as she walked to the witness chair, and her eyes were red from the tears she had cried in the days leading up to the trial. She was young, vulnerable, and the weight of her guilt seemed to hang heavily over her. As the trial continued, the courtroom atmosphere became even more charged with tension. The residents of Greenfield, still reeling from the shocking murder, sat quietly, waiting for the next revelation in the case that had gripped their town. The details were slowly coming to light, but no one could have predicted just how deep the secrets went. The defense had already painted Emily McAllister as a young, manipulated girl, while the prosecution was determined to prove that she had premeditated the murder. The townspeople were torn between sympathy and disbelief, but one thing was becoming clear. Emily was not the innocent girl she had once appeared to be. Detective Lisa Matthews had been on the case since the beginning. She was a woman of few words but possessed an unyielding determination to uncover the truth. Her quiet demeanor in the courtroom was in sharp contrast to her relentless pursuit of justice behind the scenes. Detective Matthews, Claire Dawson began, her voice steady but with an air of anticipation. Can you tell the jury about the investigation into Father Daniel's death? Detective Matthews nodded. Yes. After Father Daniel's body was discovered, we immediately began gathering evidence. We collected the bloodstains from the church, and we also found fingerprints on the candlestick, the weapon that Emily later admitted to using during her testimony. We also discovered that the church's surveillance system had been tampered with, suggesting that someone had attempted to hide evidence. The prosecutor's words hung in the air as she went on. But perhaps the most telling piece of evidence was the forensic analysis of Father Daniel's injuries. The coroner determined that the blows to his head were consistent with someone striking him multiple times with intent. There was no sign of a struggle that would suggest self-defense. As Detective Matthews spoke, Emily's face grew pale, her eyes shifting nervously from the detective to the jury. She had claimed that she had acted in self-defense, but the evidence was now pointing to a different story. One of the most damning pieces of evidence came from the church's surveillance cameras. The footage, captured the night of the murder, showed Emily entering the church with Father Daniel. The two appeared to be having a heated conversation, but it wasn't until later in the footage that things took a darker turn. The camera captured Emily walking into the church's back room, where the altercation would later occur. A few minutes later, she emerged from the room, visibly agitated, and left the building. What stood out in the footage was the distinct lack of urgency in her movements. She didn't appear panicked, nor did she make any attempt to call for help. "Why didn't you leave?" Claire Dawson asked as she questioned Emily about the surveillance footage. "Why didn't you run for help? Why didn't you show any signs of distress after the altercation?" Emily's hands trembled as she answered. "I was in shock. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what I had done." Her voice wavered, but the jury could see the cracks in her story. It was becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile her version of events with the evidence at hand. As the trial progressed, another shocking revelation came to light. Father Daniel had not been the saintly figure that the townspeople had believed him to be. While he had preached the virtues of faith and devotion, he had led a double life, one filled with secrets that would have scandalized the community if they were ever to be discovered. Detective Matthews had uncovered a series of private letters and photographs that Father Daniel had kept hidden. These letters, some written by Emily herself, revealed the depth of their illicit affair. But there was something more unsettling in the correspondence. Father Daniel had been grooming Emily from the moment they met. The letters were full of religious language, justifying his actions as part of a divine plan. Father Daniel had convinced Emily that their relationship was part of a greater purpose, that they were somehow meant to be together. He preyed on her vulnerability, using his position of authority to manipulate her into submission. Emily's face flushed with shame as Detective Matthews read aloud from one of the letters during the trial. "I know this is difficult, but we must trust in God's will. What we share is sacred, and we are meant to be together. Don't be afraid, Emily. You are special to me, and I will protect you." The detective read, her voice steady despite the weight of the words. Emily's heart pounded as the truth of their relationship was exposed for all to see. She had been so young, so impressionable, and Father Daniel had used that to his advantage. But did that excuse her actions? The defense, in a last-ditch effort to salvage Emily's case, tried to argue that Father Daniel's manipulation was what drove her to kill. The day had arrived. The people of Greenfield gathered in the town square, their eyes fixed on the courthouse where the fate of Emily McAllister was about to be decided. The trial had captivated the small, tight-knit community for weeks, and now as the jury entered the deliberation room, everyone held their breath. The murder of Father Daniel was a tragedy that had torn apart not only the lives of those involved, but the very fabric of their town. Would justice be served, or would the dark secrets buried beneath this crime remain hidden forever? The courthouse was filled with nervous anticipation. Friends, family, and residents of Greenfield anxiously awaited the verdict. Some stood in small groups whispering, while others sat alone, lost in their thoughts. In the courtroom, Emily McAllister sat motionless, her hands clasped tightly together. Her eyes, once filled with defiance, were now clouded with fear and uncertainty. She had come a long way from the confident young woman who had first walked into the courtroom, and now, in her most vulnerable moment, she couldn't shake the feeling that her future, her very life, was about to be determined by 12 strangers. Her defense attorney, a seasoned lawyer named Angela Carter, had done her best to present a case that painted Emily as a victim. She had argued that the manipulative and coercive nature of Father Daniel's relationship with Emily had driven her to kill him, and that she should be considered not guilty by reason of self-defense or diminished capacity. However, the prosecution, led by Claire Dawson, had painted a starkly different picture. They had emphasized that Emily's actions were premeditated and that her cold demeanor after the murder suggested a lack of remorse or fear. Outside the courthouse, the townspeople anxiously looked up at the clock. Each second seemed to stretch endlessly as the jury deliberated. Some believed that Emily deserved sympathy. After all, she was just a young girl caught in the web of a man's exploitation. Others felt that Father Daniel's death had to be avenged, regardless of the complicated circumstances that led to it. Finally, after hours of deliberation, the doors to the courtroom opened. The jury had returned. The judge, a stern man with glasses perched on the end of his nose, motioned for silence as the foreman of the jury stepped forward. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Emily McAllister, guilty of second-degree murder." The words echoed in the courtroom, sending shockwaves through the crowd. Emily's face drained of color. She had hoped, had clung to the belief that the jury would see her as a victim, that her actions would be justified. But the reality was harsher than she could have imagined. The weight of the verdict settled over her like a suffocating blanket. Her defense attorney, Angela Carter, immediately stood up, her voice shaking as she asked the judge for leniency in sentencing. She argued that Emily had been manipulated and groomed by Father Daniel, and that she had acted in a moment of desperation. But Judge Matthews remained firm. "We will proceed to sentencing in due time," the judge said coldly. As Emily was led away in handcuffs, her eyes flickered toward the crowd. Her mother, Susan, sat at the back of the courtroom, her face pale and tear-streaked. Emily's father, Mark McAllister, was nowhere to be seen. It was clear that the impact of the trial and the shocking verdict had left the family divided. Greenfield would never be the same. The small, peaceful town had been irrevocably changed by the tragedy that had unfolded in its heart. The once respected Father Daniel's life was remembered with shock and horror, while Emily McAllister's future lay in tatters. The town, so tightly knit just a few months ago, was now fractured. Some residents expressed disbelief over the verdict. How could a young girl manipulated by a trusted member of the clergy be found guilty of second-degree murder? They believed Emily's actions were a result of desperation, and that she had been driven to her breaking point. Others, however, felt that justice had been served. Father Daniel's actions were reprehensible, but Emily's response had been violent and calculated. In the aftermath of the trial, rumors about the affair between Emily and Father Daniel began to spread like wildfire. No one had known the extent of their relationship, and the revelation sent ripples of disgust through the community. Emily's name became synonymous with scandal, and whispers of her involvement with a priest, a man she had once trusted and admired, filled every corner of Greenfield. Detective Lisa Matthews, who had worked tirelessly on the case, took a moment to reflect on the investigation. As she sat in her office, going over the case files one last time, she couldn't help but feel a sense of closure, albeit a bittersweet one. She had seen countless cases in her career, but the complexity of this one had troubled her. The days following Emily McAllister's conviction were fraught with uncertainty. Greenfield was still reeling from the shock of the trial, and its residents had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the church, the people they had trusted, and the secrets that had been kept hidden for far too long. Emily's future, once bright and full of promise, now seemed shrouded in darkness. But as the court proceedings continued, it became clear that the story was far from over. The day of Emily's sentencing arrived, and once again, the town's courthouse was filled with spectators. The room was more subdued this time, and a sense of finality hung in the air. Emily stood before the judge, her hands still shackled, her face pale, and her eyes downcast. She had always carried herself with an air of confidence, but now she looked small and fragile, almost like the young girl she once had been before everything had spiraled out of control. Her defense attorney, Angela Carter, stood by her side, trying to muster a sense of hope in her voice. "Your Honor, we ask for leniency. Emily has suffered enough. She is a young woman who made a tragic mistake, and we believe she deserves a chance at rehabilitation." The prosecutor, Claire Dawson, stood across from her, her face hard and resolute. "The defendant has not shown remorse for her actions, nor has she taken full responsibility for the life she took. Justice demands that she be held accountable, not only for the murder of Father Daniel, but for the damage she has caused to this community." Judge Matthews, who had presided over the trial, took a long pause before speaking. He glanced at Emily one last time, his expression unreadable. "The court has considered all the evidence, the testimonies, and the circumstances surrounding this case. Emily McAllister, you have been convicted of second-degree murder. It is the decision of this court that you be sentenced to 20 years in prison." The words were like a hammer striking Emily's chest. She had hoped for a more lenient sentence, perhaps parole in a few years. But it seemed as though the court had decided to make an example of her. The full weight of her actions and the consequences of her choices was now sinking in. The news of her sentence spread like wildfire through Greenfield. Some were relieved that the case was finally coming to a close, while others felt a sense of betrayal. How could the young girl they had watched grow up be capable of taking someone's life, even if that person had hurt her? The division in the town deepened, and the tension between those who sympathized with Emily and those who felt justice had been served became palpable. In the prison where Emily was sent, life was harsh. The walls were cold and unforgiving, and the freedom she had once taken for granted now seemed like a distant memory. She spent her days in solitude, reflecting on everything that had led her to this point. But one thing was certain: Emily's story wasn't over. The years spent in prison would change her, force her to confront her inner demons, and perhaps, in time, she would be given the opportunity to rebuild her life. But for now, she was forced to endure the consequences of her actions. The road to redemption was long, and she wasn't sure if she could ever truly find it. But as the days passed, Emily began to realize that her journey wasn't just about seeking forgiveness from the people she had wronged. It was about finding forgiveness within herself. Detective Lisa Matthews, who had been instrumental in uncovering the truth behind Father Daniel's death, knew that the case was far from simple. While Emily had been convicted, the more Matthews reflected on the investigation, the more she wondered if there were still pieces of the puzzle missing. She had spent months sifting through evidence, speaking with witnesses, and uncovering the hidden dynamics of Father Daniel's life. But something about the case still gnawed at her. There was a lingering question she couldn't shake. How could a young, seemingly innocent girl be driven to such violence by a relationship that, on the surface, seemed like a typical affair? Matthews revisited the church records and Father Daniel's personal belongings, determined to uncover anything she may have missed. She had already discovered that Father Daniel had been secretly keeping journals, documenting his interactions with Emily. But these were not the journals of a man grappling with guilt. Instead, they were filled with manipulative language, controlling behavior, and a growing obsession with Emily. In the weeks that followed, Detective Matthews pieced together a fuller picture of the relationship between Emily and Father Daniel. She discovered more about the manipulation, the way Father Daniel had groomed Emily from a young age, planting seeds of doubt about her worth and her place in the world. The months had passed, and life had started to settle into a somber routine for Emily McAllister. Her existence within the prison walls was no longer marked by the frantic despair of her first days, nor by the sharp pangs of regret that had once threatened to drown her. Instead, she was learning to accept her reality. Prison had become a place of reflection, a place where she could finally begin to understand the full extent of her past and her own role in the tragedy that had unfolded. But outside the prison, the reverberations of Emily's actions continued to echo through Greenfield. Though the case was technically closed, Detective Lisa Matthews couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to uncover. The pieces of the puzzle that had seemed to fit so perfectly still left gaps. Questions that, until now, hadn't been answered. Detective Matthews found herself in her office late one evening, poring over the case file once again. The reports, the interviews, the confessions, they were all there, neatly compiled and cataloged. Yet something didn't sit right with her. She had spent so much time focusing on the relationship between Emily and Father Daniel, but she hadn't fully explored the priest's other connections. It was clear that Father Daniel's power had extended far beyond his role as a religious leader. He had been a man who had manipulated people, not just Emily. Matthews recalled the interviews with the parishioners, many of whom had described Father Daniel as a man of great charisma, a man who could sway crowds with just a few words. But what had they not seen? What had they failed to notice? Matthews started to look deeper into the financial records of the church. Donations, funds, and charitable events, all of it seemed above board at first glance. But she had a hunch. There had to be something there. Something that would tie Father Daniel's hidden world together. It didn't take long for Matthews to uncover a pattern. The financial records were far more complicated than they appeared. Large sums of money had been funneled through the church, most of it being funneled into accounts that were linked to Father Daniel. What struck Matthews was the consistent transfers to a private account that seemed to have no direct ties to the church's legitimate activities. The more Matthews dug, the more she realized that Father Daniel had been involved in something much darker than simple manipulation. He had been running a secret operation, one that exploited vulnerable women, using the church's resources as a cover. Emily had not been the only girl he had lured into his web. There had been others, young women who had been groomed and taken advantage of under the guise of spiritual guidance. But Emily had been different. She had been the one who had fought back. She had been the one who had seen through his facade and broken free, but at the ultimate cost. As Matthews pieced together the financial records and testimonies, the full scale of Father Daniel's crimes began to emerge. It was clear now that the affair with Emily was not a simple case of a troubled priest's fall from grace. It was part of a larger, more sinister pattern of manipulation and exploitation. Father Daniel's obsession with Emily had not been driven by love or even desire. No, it had been about control. He had seen in Emily a vulnerability he could exploit, someone who could be shaped into the person he wanted her to be, someone who could carry out his dark desires without question. But what had driven Emily to murder him? Matthews revisited the moments leading up to the tragic event. There had been the argument in the church basement, the explosive confrontation, and then the violent end. But Emily had not acted out of cold blood. She had acted out of desperation, a desperate need to escape the suffocating control of a man who had held her captive for far too long. As Matthews read through the final police reports, she began to understand that Emily had not killed Father Daniel because of the affair. It was because of the years of psychological torment he had inflicted on her. Emily had seen no way out, and in that moment, her survival instincts had kicked in. In her mind, it had been kill or be killed. Greenfield, meanwhile, had been forever changed. The community had always prided itself on its strong faith and close-knit nature. But the events surrounding Father Daniel's death had torn the town apart. Families had been divided, friends had become strangers, and the very foundation of their trust in the church had been shattered. Some people still stood by Father Daniel, choosing to believe that he had been the victim of a young girl's anger and impulsive decisions. Others, like the members of the McAllister family, saw Emily as a broken soul who had simply fallen prey to a man who should have been a protector, not a predator. The divide was wide, and it seemed as though there was no room for reconciliation. The town of Greenfield was now a place of quiet reflection, as the community slowly came to terms with the harrowing events that had unfolded over the past year. Father Daniel's death, the investigation, and the eventual revelation of the dark secrets he had kept hidden for so long had left the town in a state of shock. But it was also a place of quiet resolve, as the people began to heal and rebuild the trust that had been broken. Detective Lisa Matthews had made it her mission to uncover every detail of Father Daniel's crimes, and she had succeeded. Her tireless pursuit of justice had led to the exposure of a web of manipulation, abuse, and exploitation that had extended far beyond what anyone could have imagined. But with Father Daniel dead and Emily behind bars, was justice truly served? Months after the case was closed, Matthews continued to review the case files, her mind never fully able to let go of the questions that still lingered. The financial records of the church had shown clear signs of fraudulent activities, and Father Daniel's manipulations had spanned years. Yet the full scope of his network remained a mystery. No one else had been implicated, but Matthews had a strong suspicion that there were still others who had been involved, perhaps unknowingly, in Father Daniel's exploitation. One name kept resurfacing in her thoughts: Father Daniel's closest confidant at the church, a fellow priest named Father Andrew. Matthews had questioned him during the investigation, but his answers had always been vague and unsatisfactory. Could he have known about Father Daniel's actions? Was he complicit in some way? Matthews was determined to find out. The days were long, but Matthews knew she had to press on. She contacted other law enforcement agencies and religious organizations, sharing the information she had gathered. Soon she was receiving tips and leads from unexpected sources. The more she dug, the more she uncovered. Father Andrew had been more than just an innocent bystander. He had been complicit in some of the darkest moments of Father Daniel's reign of terror. A few weeks later, Matthews and a team of officers made their way to the church where Father Andrew continued to serve. His demeanor had always been one of calm, of piety, but now as Matthews watched him from a distance, she could sense something different. There was no longer any pretense, no more facade of holiness. Father Andrew knew what was coming. When Matthews and her team approached him, they did so with caution. Father Andrew was calm, but his eyes betrayed a hint of fear. He knew that the investigation was no longer just about Father Daniel. It was about him, too, and the weight of his actions was about to come crashing down on him. With a steady voice, Matthews informed Father Andrew of the charges against him. He was arrested for aiding and abetting Father Daniel's manipulative actions, for covering up the abuse, and for enabling the exploitation of vulnerable women within the church's care. It wasn't just about Father Daniel anymore. It was about a system of corruption that had allowed this abuse to go unchecked for far too long. Father Andrew's arrest sent shockwaves through Greenfield. The town that had once placed so much faith in its clergy was now reeling from the knowledge that one of their own had been complicit in such horrific acts. It was a blow to the community's spirit, but it was also a necessary step toward healing. Meanwhile, Emily McAllister sat quietly in her prison cell, awaiting her trial. The months she had spent behind bars had been difficult, filled with self-doubt and regret. But as time passed, Emily began to reflect on the truth of what had happened. She had been a victim, but she had also been a perpetrator of violence. The guilt weighed heavily on her, and she struggled to find a way to reconcile the two sides of her story. Her trial, when it finally came, was a somber affair. Emily's defense argued that she had acted in self-defense, that she had been pushed to the brink by the years of manipulation and abuse at the hands of Father Daniel. The prosecution, however, maintained that Emily had taken matters into her own hands and had killed Father Daniel in a fit of rage. The jury deliberated for hours before reaching a verdict. In the end, they found Emily guilty of manslaughter, not murder. The jury acknowledged the emotional and psychological toll that Father Daniel's abuse had taken on her, but they also recognized that her actions had been extreme and violent. Emily was sentenced to 15 years in prison. It wasn't the life sentence some had expected, but it was a verdict that seemed to strike a balance between justice and the complexities of the situation. As the months passed, the people of Greenfield slowly began to rebuild. The church, once a place of unwavering faith, now stood as a symbol of the corruption that had been hidden within its walls. Father Andrew's trial loomed on the horizon, and it was clear that more revelations would come to light. The community, scarred but resolute, started to move forward, even as they struggled to reconcile their love for the church with the truth that had been uncovered. For Detective Matthews, the case was far from over. She had uncovered the darkness that had infected the town, but there were still loose ends to tie up. She continued her investigation into the larger network of people who had been involved, knowing that the work was far from complete. But for Emily, the road to redemption would be long and difficult. She had been a victim, and yet she had become a perpetrator of violence. There was no easy way to undo the damage, no way to change the past. But in the years to come, Emily would work tirelessly to understand the truth of her actions, to find forgiveness for herself and for the lives that had been shattered by Father Daniel's lies. Greenfield would never be the same. The scars left by Father Daniel's abuse, the murder, and the trial would take generations to heal. But as the years passed, the town found a new sense of unity, one built on truth and the determination to prevent such horrors from happening again. And though Emily McAllister's name would forever be associated with the tragedy, the legacy of her story would not be one of violence. It would be one of redemption, a reminder of the power of truth and the importance of never turning a blind eye to the darkness that can lurk within even the most sacred of places.